The town of Arbor Hollow had always been quiet, nestled deep in a valley where cell reception faltered and the outside world seemed to forget its existence. Locals prided themselves on their close-knit community, but behind the charm lay secrets buried deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks surrounding the town. It had been 20 years since the night Caleb Vance vanished. His disappearance had become a ghost story whispered at bonfires and slumber parties, a local legend cemented by his photograph still pinned on the corkboard at the sheriff's office. It showed Caleb as a young man, barely 22, with an easy smile and tousled blonde hair. The kind of guy everyone liked, but no one really knew. When Caleb walked into town that gray November morning, the mist seemed to part for him. He looked exactly as he had 2 decades ago. His clothes, though faded and frayed, were the same as the night he vanished, jeans and a flannel shirt. He strolled down Main Street like nothing had happened, his hands tucked in his pockets, his eyes scanning the familiar storefronts. The first to see him was Lydia Hastings, the owner of the local diner. She froze as he pushed the door open, her coffee pot trembling in her hand. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice cracking. He smiled at her, and the room fell silent. "Morning, Lydia," he said, his voice light, almost teasing. "You still make the best coffee in town?" The silence snapped as patrons rushed forward, their questions tumbling over each other. Where had he been? Was he hurt? Why hadn't he aged a day? Caleb chuckled softly, his answers vague but soothing. He didn't remember much, he said, just that he had been lost and somehow found his way back. By noon, the entire town buzzed with his return. Reporters were called, though none could reach the secluded town in time to capture the phenomenon. Caleb seemed happy to see old friends and neighbors, but he avoided anything deeper than small talk. Sheriff Mark Calloway, now graying and gruff, watched him with wary eyes from the edge of the diner, the weight of years of unanswered questions pressing on his chest. Among the crowd was Evelyn Marsh, a journalist turned librarian, who had been a teenager when Caleb disappeared. She stood at the back, observing, a knot tightening in her stomach. Caleb's easy smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something unsettling in the way his shadow stretched and twisted, even when he stood still. That night, Evelyn sat by her bedroom window, watching as the mist crept into town. Caleb's face haunted her thoughts. He had returned, but something wasn't right. In the distance, she saw him walking down the empty street, his silhouette sharp against the fog. His shadow, however, moved differently, lagging behind like an afterthought. The town welcomed Caleb with open arms, but Evelyn couldn't shake the chill that followed him. 20 years had passed since the town had lost him. Now, he was back, and with him came a sense of unease that settled over Arbor Hollow like a storm waiting to break. The morning after Caleb's return, Arbor Hollow brimmed with cautious excitement. Word had spread, and locals gathered at the diner, recounting every detail of his reappearance. Some spoke of miracles, others whispered of curses, but no one could deny the strange unease that had settled over the town like a heavy fog. Evelyn stood in her small kitchen, staring at the article she'd clipped from the local paper 20 years ago. The headline read, "Local man vanishes without a trace." Beneath it was Caleb's photograph, the same bright smile that had greeted the town yesterday. She traced her finger over the yellowed paper. How could he look exactly the same? She couldn't shake what she'd seen last night. Caleb's shadow moving independently, slithering behind him like a separate entity. Evelyn needed answers. She started her investigation at the town archives, a dusty room tucked into the library's basement. As the town librarian, she had access to everything: police reports, personal letters, even the town's unofficial records. It was here she found the forgotten pieces of Arbor Hollow's past. In a file marked Unsolved Mysteries, she uncovered a disturbing connection. Caleb wasn't the first person to vanish. Every 20 years, almost to the day, someone from the town disappeared, only for strange phenomena to follow. In 1978, a woman named Abigail Green had gone missing. In 1958, it was a boy just 10 years old. Both were never seen again. But there was something else. Accounts of strange illnesses that plagued the townspeople after each disappearance. Fever, hallucinations, a debilitating lethargy. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read on. The symptoms were described as mild at first, but in every instance, the illnesses worsened, leading to unexplained deaths. That afternoon, Evelyn went to see Sheriff Calloway. His office was cluttered with paperwork and old coffee mugs, but it was his expression that made her pause. He looked drained, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept since Caleb's return. "Sheriff," Evelyn began cautiously, "I need to talk to you about Caleb." Calloway leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Let me guess, you think something's wrong with him?" Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "You've noticed it too?" "Of course I have," Calloway said, his voice low. "I don't know what Caleb is, but he's not the man I remember. And you've seen the others, haven't you?" "The others?" Calloway stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside, a small group of people lingered near the diner. Evelyn recognized a few of them. Lydia Hastings, Mr. Grayson from the hardware store, and a teenager named Dylan. "They've all been spending time with Caleb," Calloway explained. "And now they're sick. It's subtle, but it's their pale skin, coughing, complaints of exhaustion. It's starting again." "Starting again?" Evelyn pressed. Calloway sighed, his face grim. "You're not the first person to notice the pattern. I've been here long enough to see it happen before. People get sick, Evelyn, and some of them don't get better." Evelyn's stomach churned. "And Caleb? What's he doing here? Why now?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Calloway said, turning back to her. "If you're digging into this, tread carefully. Whatever brought Caleb back isn't something you want to mess with." That evening, Evelyn decided to confront Caleb directly. She found him sitting on a bench in the town square, staring up at the clock tower. The dim light of the street lamp cast long, eerie shadows across his face. "Caleb," she called softly, stepping closer. He turned, his smile as disarming as ever. "Evelyn, it's good to see you. Been a long time." She swallowed hard, her resolve firm. "I need to ask you something. Where have you been all these years?" Caleb's smile faltered, just for a moment. "That's a long story," he said, his tone light. "I don't think you'd believe me. Try me." He stood, towering over her. His shadow stretched unnaturally far, curling around the base of the clock tower like a living thing. "I've been away," Caleb said cryptically, "but now I'm back. Isn't that all that matters?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she saw his shadow twitch, as if aware of her gaze. "I'm not sure it is," she whispered. Caleb chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You always were the curious one, Evelyn. Be careful. Curiosity has a way of getting people hurt." As he walked away, Evelyn stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb's shadow lingered behind for just a moment longer, its shape twisting into something monstrous before melting into the night. The following day, Arbor Hollow seemed both eerily normal and unnervingly wrong. The sun shone weakly through a veil of gray clouds, and the streets bustled with their usual quiet rhythm. Yet, whispers of sickness spread among the townspeople. Lydia Hastings had closed the diner, claiming she felt too weak to work. Mr. Grayson had been seen stumbling out of his hardware store, pale and coughing. Evelyn kept her head low as she walked through town, clutching her notebook. The conversation with Caleb from the night before played in her mind like a broken record. His cryptic words, his twitching shadow, and the unsettling chill that lingered after he'd gone. It all pointed to something far darker than she dared admit. She returned to the library, a sanctuary where she could think. Dust motes swirled in the dim light as she sifted through old town records, searching for any clue to explain the connection between Caleb's return and the sickness spreading through Arbor Hollow. In a journal written by a former mayor in 1958, Evelyn found a chilling entry. "The boy's disappearance is strange enough, but now the air feels thick, and people are falling ill. The preacher says it's God's punishment, but it feels like something else entirely. I keep hearing whispers at night. I don't know what to believe anymore." The pattern was undeniable. Every disappearance brought not only grief, but a lingering presence that seeped into the town, making it sick, making it wrong. Evelyn scribbled frantic notes, trying to connect the dots. That evening, she visited Sheriff Calloway again, finding him looking worse than before. His face was drawn, his hands trembling as he pored over reports of new illnesses cropping up around town. "More people are sick," he said without preamble. "This isn't the flu, Evelyn. Something's happening, just like before." Evelyn hesitated, then showed him the journal entry she'd found. "It's happened every time someone disappeared. Caleb's return, it's like a trigger." "But why?" Calloway frowned, his eyes scanning the words. "The preacher back then thought it was punishment. Others thought it was a curse. You think it has something to do with Caleb?" "I don't just think," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "I know it does. And it's not just him. It's his shadow." Calloway looked up sharply. "His shadow. I saw it move, separately, like it's alive. And last night, it—" Evelyn trailed off, shuddering at the memory of the shadow twisting into something inhuman. Calloway rubbed his jaw, his skepticism clear, but he didn't dismiss her outright. "If you're right, then we need to figure out what Caleb really is." That night, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The small apartment above the library was quiet, but shadows danced unnaturally on the walls, stretching and curling in ways they shouldn't. She tried to sleep, but was startled awake by a sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging across glass. Her heart raced as she realized it was coming from the window. Slowly, she approached, her breath fogging the cold glass. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw Caleb standing across the street, staring up at her. He didn't move, didn't wave, but his shadow stretched across the pavement, slithering up the side of the building toward her window. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her chest as the shadow brushed against the glass, black and oily. A faint voice whispered through the room, soft and mocking. "You're getting too close, Evelyn." Terrified, she grabbed her phone and called Calloway. The sheriff's groggy voice answered after several rings. "I need you to come to the library," she said, her voice trembling. "Caleb's outside. He is shadow." The line went dead. Evelyn stared at her phone in disbelief before throwing on a coat and grabbing a flashlight. If Calloway wasn't coming, she had to face this herself. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped outside. But when she reached the street, Caleb was gone. Only his shadow remained, burned into the asphalt like a stain. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stared at the shadow burned into the asphalt. It was motionless now, a dark smear against the pale light of the street lamp. She shone her flashlight on it, expecting it to vanish like a trick of the eye, but it remained, solid, defiant. Her phone buzzed, and she fumbled it from her pocket. It was Sheriff Calloway. "I got cut off earlier," he said. His voice was tense. "Are you okay?" "Not really," Evelyn replied, glancing around. "Caleb's shadow. It's still here, but he's gone." Calloway sighed heavily. "Stay put. I'm coming to you." Minutes later, the sheriff's truck pulled up, its headlights slicing through the mist. Calloway stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. He approached the shadow cautiously, his boots crunching against the gravel. "That's not normal," he muttered, crouching to inspect it. Evelyn nodded. "It's like it's alive. I've never seen anything like this." Calloway rubbed the back of his neck, clearly unsettled. "We need more than guesses. If this thing is connected to Caleb, we gotta figure out what brought him back and why people are getting sick." "I found something in the archives," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. Every disappearance was followed by strange illnesses. And then deaths. The sheriff looked at her sharply. "Deaths? How many?" "Enough," she replied grimly. "It's a pattern, Calloway. Caleb's return is just the latest piece of it." The two of them decided to visit someone who might have answers. Edna Foster, the town's oldest resident. She was a fixture in Arbor Hollow, her memory a trove of local history. Evelyn and Calloway found Edna in her small, cluttered house at the edge of town. She greeted them with a knowing smile, her sharp eyes glinting behind thick glasses. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, motioning them inside. "Everyone's talking about Caleb. Strange business, that." They explained what they had seen, from the moving shadow to the illnesses plaguing the town. As they spoke, Edna's expression darkened. "You're not the first to ask these questions," she said, her voice low. This town has its secrets, and Caleb's tied to one of the oldest. What do you mean? Evelyn pressed. Edna hesitated, then reached for a faded photograph on her shelf. It showed a group of townspeople gathered around a stone circle in the woods. At the center was a tall, angular figure, its face obscured by shadow. This was taken in 1901, Edna explained. It was a harvest ritual, a way to keep the town prosperous. Every 20 years, they'd offer something to the shadows. Offer something? Calloway echoed, his jaw tightening. Edna nodded solemnly. A life. Someone chosen by the town. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Are you saying Caleb was sacrificed? Not just Caleb, Edna replied. The others who disappeared, they were all offerings. But something's different this time. He's come back. And whatever brought him here, she trailed off, her gaze flicking to the window as if expecting to see something lurking in the mist. Calloway clenched his fists. If the town knew about this, why didn't they stop it? Edna gave him a sad smile. Because it worked. Every time, the town thrived for 20 years. Crops were abundant, businesses flourished, no one wanted for anything. People justified it, said it was a small price to pay. Evelyn felt sick. But now he's back, and people are getting sick. What does it mean? I don't know, Edna admitted. But I'll tell you this. The shadows don't give without taking something in return. If Caleb's back, it's because they want something. As they left Edna's house, the weight of her words pressed heavily on Evelyn's chest. The town had sacrificed its own to ensure its survival. But now, the shadows had returned, and they weren't done. That night, Evelyn dreamed of the photograph. The figure in the center turned slowly toward her, its shadowed face splitting into a grin that was all teeth. When she woke, her bedroom window was open, and Caleb's voice whispered faintly in the darkness. Why are you looking, Evelyn? Evelyn sat bolt upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice was gone, and the room was still, but the chill lingered. She crossed the room to close the window, her hands trembling as she latched it shut. She needed answers, real answers, not just folklore and whispered warnings. The photograph Edna had shown them confirmed one thing. The town had a connection to the shadows, a connection far older than Caleb's disappearance. But why had he returned? And what did the shadows want now? By the time morning came, Evelyn was already at the library. She pored over old maps and records, looking for anything that might point her toward the stone circle Edna had mentioned. Hidden among the yellowed papers was a crude map of the surrounding woods, with a faint marking labeled the Hollow Altar. That's it, she whispered, tracing the route with her finger. Her resolve was set. If she wanted to uncover the truth, she needed to see this altar for herself. Sheriff Calloway wasn't thrilled about the plan. You want to go wandering into the woods alone? He said, his tone sharp. Have you lost your mind? I'm not asking for permission, Calloway, Evelyn replied, stuffing the map into her bag. This is the only lead we have. If we wait any longer, more people are going to get sick. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. At least let me come with you. If there's something out there. It's not a good idea, Evelyn interrupted. You're already showing symptoms, aren't you? The cough? The fatigue? I need you here, keeping an eye on Caleb. Calloway hesitated, but nodded reluctantly. Fine, but if you're not back by sundown, I'm coming after you. The path to the altar was overgrown and treacherous. Branches clawed at Evelyn's arms as she pushed through the dense underbrush, the woods growing darker with every step. The deeper she went, the more the air seemed to thicken, until it felt like she was wading through water. When she finally emerged into a clearing, her breath caught. The stone circle was ancient, the gray monoliths weathered and cracked, yet still standing defiantly in a perfect ring. The ground within the circle was bare, the earth blackened as if burned. Evelyn approached cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. In the center of the circle lay a strange symbol carved into the ground, jagged and precise, radiating an aura of cold dread. As she studied it, a faint whisper reached her ears. Evelyn! She spun around, but the clearing was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if multiple voices were calling her name. Evelyn, Her flashlight flickered, the beam weakening until it died altogether. Darkness closed in around her, and the whispers grew into a cacophony, overlapping and incomprehensible. "Why are you here?" a voice boomed, silencing the others. Evelyn's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. "Who are you?" she choked out, her voice barely audible. "We are the Hollow," the voice replied, reverberating through the air like a thunderclap. "We have given, and now we take. What do you want?" Evelyn demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "Why, Caleb? Why now?" The shadows within the circle twisted, coalescing into a towering figure with blazing red eyes. "Caleb is ours," it said, its voice low and menacing. "He was taken, as were the others before him. But your town has grown weak, greedy. Now, the debt must be paid." "What debt?" Evelyn shouted, her voice trembling. "For every gift, there is a price," the figure hissed. "You take, and we take. But you have taken too much. Caleb was the balance, and now he is the undoing." The figure's eyes flared brighter, and the whispers returned, swirling around Evelyn like a storm. "Leave, or be taken," the voice commanded. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she fled the clearing. The shadows clawed at her heels, but she didn't stop until she burst out of the woods, gasping for air. She stumbled into her car, slamming the door shut and gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The Hollow wanted something from Arbor Hollow, and if Evelyn didn't figure out how to stop it, the entire town would pay the price. Evelyn drove back to town with trembling hands, her mind reeling from the encounter at the altar. The Hollow's words echoed in her head. "For every gift, there is a price." The town had thrived, but at what cost? And now, the balance had been shattered, threatening to destroy everything. She parked in front of the sheriff's office, where Calloway was waiting, his face lined with worry. "What the hell happened out there?" he demanded as she stumbled inside. Evelyn dropped into a chair, her breathing uneven. "The Hollow, it spoke to me. It's real, Calloway. It's all real. Caleb, the disappearances, the sickness, it's all connected." Calloway leaned against his desk, his expression grim. "What does it want?" "Payment," Evelyn said, her voice hollow. "It wants balance. The town's taken too much, and now it's coming to collect." The sheriff ran a hand down his face. "And Caleb? What is he in all this?" Evelyn hesitated, the memory of the towering shadow figure fresh in her mind. "He's part of the debt. He was an offering, like the others before him. But he came back, and that's what broke the balance." "Why did he come back?" Calloway pressed. "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "But we need to find out." Their first stop was the Hastings house. Lydia, who had been one of the first to fall ill after Caleb's return, was now bedridden. Her husband answered the door, his face drawn with exhaustion. "She's not doing well," he said, leading them to the bedroom. Lydia lay motionless, her skin pale and damp with sweat. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard Evelyn's voice. "He came to see me," Lydia murmured weakly. "Caleb?" Evelyn asked, kneeling beside the bed. Lydia nodded. "He said he wanted to apologize for what was coming." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Did he say why?" Lydia's breathing grew labored, and her words were faint. "He said it wasn't his choice, but he couldn't stop it." Calloway put a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, motioning for her to step back. "We should let her rest," he said quietly. They left the house in silence, the weight of Lydia's words heavy between them. That night, Evelyn pored over everything she had gathered. Old records, Edna's photograph, the map of the altar. One thing nagged at her. Why now? Caleb's return had triggered the sickness, but it felt deliberate, as though the Hollow had chosen this moment for a reason. She sifted through Caleb's police file, looking for anything she might have missed. Then she found it, a note from his parents, written shortly after his disappearance. Caleb had been acting strangely in the weeks before he vanished. He kept saying he heard voices, saw shadows moving when no one was there. "We thought it was stress, but now we're not so sure." Evelyn's pulse quickened. Caleb hadn't just been an offering. He'd been marked long before the Hollow took him. But why bring him back now? As she turned the page, her phone buzzed. It was Calloway. "You need to get to the diner," he said, his voice tense. "What's going on?" "It's Caleb," Calloway replied. "He's there, and he's asking for you." The diner was dimly lit, its neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. Evelyn entered cautiously, her heart pounding. Caleb sat in a booth at the back, his shadow spilling across the floor like a pool of ink. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come," he said softly. Evelyn slid into the seat across from him, her nerves on edge. "What are you doing here, Caleb?" He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I wanted to see you. You've been digging, haven't you? Trying to figure out what's happening." "I want the truth," Evelyn said firmly. "Why did you come back? What do the shadows want?" Caleb leaned forward, his voice low. "I didn't come back. They sent me. I'm a warning." "A warning for what?" "For what happens when the balance is broken," Caleb replied. His shadow writhed behind him, its movements hypnotic and grotesque. "I'm just a part of it. The sickness, the deaths, they're just the beginning." Evelyn's breath hitched. "How do we stop it?" Caleb shook his head, his expression pained. "You can't. The hollow doesn't bargain. It takes what it's owed." The lights in the diner flickered, and Caleb's shadow stretched toward Evelyn, cold and suffocating. "But you can run," Caleb whispered. "You don't have to stay here." Evelyn stared at him, her fear turning to anger. "I'm not leaving. These are my people, my home. If you know something that can help, you need to tell me." Caleb's eyes darkened, and his shadow reared up like a living thing. "Then you'll see what it means to defy the hollow." The lights went out, plunging the diner into darkness. When they flickered back on, Caleb was gone, leaving only his shadow, burned into the floor where he had sat. The diner was silent, save for Evelyn's ragged breathing. She stared at the shadow burned into the floor, its edges sharp and jagged, like the scars of a wound. The room felt colder now, emptier, as though Caleb had taken some vital part of it with him when he vanished. Evelyn rose on shaky legs and staggered out into the cool night air. Sheriff Calloway's truck screeched to a halt in the parking lot, and he jumped out, his hand already on his gun. "What happened?" he demanded, his eyes darting to the diner. "Caleb," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse. "He's gone again, but he left something behind." Calloway followed her inside, his expression darkening as he saw the shadow. He crouched next to it, his fingers hesitating above its surface. "It's like it's alive," he muttered. Evelyn nodded. "He said he didn't come back on his own. The hollow sent him as a warning." "A warning for what?" "For what happens when the balance is broken," Evelyn replied. Her words hung heavily in the air. Calloway stood, his jaw tight. If he's right, then the town doesn't stand a chance. People are getting sicker by the day. Grayson's hardware store is closed, Lydia's bedridden, and now Dylan. He collapsed at school today. The doctor says it's some kind of anemia, but it's spreading too fast for that. "We need to do something," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "If we don't figure out what the hollow wants, more people are going to die." Calloway gave her a long, searching look. "Then let's figure it out. But we need help. Someone who knows more about this than we do." The name Edna Foster had barely escaped their lips before they were knocking on her door again. The old woman let them in, her expression resigned, as though she'd been expecting them. "I told you this wasn't over," Edna said, leading them into her cluttered living room. "You've stirred up something that's been sleeping for a long time." "We didn't stir it up," Evelyn countered. "The town did. Every 20 years, they made a deal. Now the deal's broken, and the hollow is collecting." Edna nodded gravely. "The hollow thrives on imbalance. That's why the offerings worked. They kept the scales even. But Caleb coming back," she shook her head. "It's like reopening an old wound, and wounds fester." "What can we do?" Calloway asked. Edna hesitated, then shuffled to a bookshelf and pulled down an old leather-bound tome. She flipped through its brittle pages, muttering under her breath. "There's one way," she said finally, "but it's not without risk." "What is it?" Evelyn pressed. "You have to confront the hollow directly," Edna said. "Go to the altar and demand it take back what it sent. Return Caleb to the shadows." Calloway frowned. "And if it refuses?" Edna's eyes darkened. "Then you'll have to force it. But be warned, the hollow doesn't like to be challenged. If you fail, She let the words trail off, the implication clear. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Do you know why Caleb was chosen in the first place? Why him? Edna flipped back to the photograph she'd shown them before, her finger tracing the shadowy figure at the center of the altar. He wasn't chosen, she said. He was marked. Caleb was connected to the hollow in ways we don't fully understand. Maybe it saw something in him, something it could use. Evelyn exchanged a look with Calloway, both of them grappling with the weight of what they'd learned. Then we have no choice, Evelyn said. We go to the altar. Tonight. The woods were darker than before, the air thicker, the shadows more oppressive. Evelyn and Calloway moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The path twisted and turned, as though the forest itself wanted to confuse them. When they finally reached the clearing, Evelyn felt a wave of nausea. The stone circle looked the same, but the air within it seemed alive, vibrating with an unseen energy. They stepped into the circle, the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet unnaturally loud. The symbol at the center pulsed faintly, glowing with an otherworldly light. Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Hollow, I know you're here. We've come to talk. The shadows within the circle stirred, twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a vortex. The towering figure emerged again, its red eyes glowing. You dare return? It hissed, its voice echoing like thunder. Evelyn stood her ground. You sent Caleb back. Want to know why? What do you want from us? The figure loomed closer, its shadow enveloping the stones. Caleb is ours. He belongs to the hollow. His return was not for you, but for us. The balance must be restored. Then take him back, Calloway shouted, his voice breaking. If that's what you want, take him and leave the town alone. The hollow laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down their spines. It is too late. The imbalance is greater than one life. The town has taken too much for too long. Now, it must give. Evelyn's heart sank as the shadows began to close in around them. Then how do we stop it? She demanded. The hollow's eyes burned brighter. You cannot. The debt must be paid, in blood or in soul. The shadows surged forward, and Evelyn's flashlight flickered. She tightened her grip, her mind racing. The hollow wasn't going to let them leave unscathed. The shadows surged, clawing at the edges of the circle, and Evelyn felt the temperature plummet. Her breath came out in trembling clouds as she stood her ground, the weight of the hollow's presence pressing down on her. Sheriff Calloway, standing just a few feet away, gripped his flashlight like a weapon, though it flickered and dimmed under the oppressive darkness. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cracking but firm. You said the debt must be paid. What does that mean? What do you want from us? The hollow figure loomed closer, its glowing red eyes piercing through the black mist. Your town's greed has festered for decades. Its people have taken without thought, offered lives without remorse. Now the balance is beyond repair. The debt must be paid in blood. What kind of blood? Evelyn demanded, fear and anger warring in her chest. The hollow tilted its head, the motion unervingly human. One must willingly return to the shadows, a life freely given. Evelyn's pulse quickened. You want someone to sacrifice themselves? It is the only way to satisfy the debt, the hollow hissed. If no offering is made, the town will wither. Your people will rot from within, one by one, until none remain. Calloway stepped forward, his jaw tight. Why should we trust you? What's to stop you from taking the offering and destroying the town anyway? The hollow's laugh was low and guttural, echoing through the clearing. You have no choice. Defy us, and you will see the depths of our wrath. The sheriff clenched his fists, his face pale. Evelyn glanced at him, then back at the towering shadow. What happens if someone goes willingly? She asked. The balance is restored, the hollow said. The town will flourish, as it once did. But the offering must choose of their own free will. Any attempt to deceive us will be met with ruin. Evelyn's stomach churned. A willing sacrifice. The weight of the hollow's demand pressed down on her, its implications chilling. Let us think about it, she said, her voice trembling. The hollow's form began to dissolve, its red eyes burning like embers in the darkness. You do not have long. Choose, or we will choose for you. As the figure vanished, the oppressive air lifted slightly. Evelyn and Calloway stood in silence for a long moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. Back at the sheriff's office, Evelyn paced the floor, her thoughts racing. Calloway sat at his desk, his face buried in his hands. "They want a life," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "A willing sacrifice to reset the balance." Calloway looked up, his eyes haunted. "And if no one steps up, the town dies." Evelyn stopped pacing and faced him. "Do you think Caleb knew this? Is that why he came back?" The sheriff shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe the Hollow's just using him to send a message. Either way, he's not the one calling the shots." Evelyn sat down, her head in her hands. Who would do it? Who would give themselves up like that? Calloway didn't answer, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. The next day, Evelyn returned to the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could offer an alternative. She searched through every record, every faded newspaper clipping, but the story was always the same: a life for the town's prosperity. No one had ever defied the Hollow and lived to tell the tale. By afternoon, the library door creaked open and Caleb walked in. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding as a shadow stretched unnaturally behind him. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice calm but tinged with sadness. Evelyn stood, gripping the edge of the desk. "What do you want, Caleb?" "I came to say goodbye," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "What are you talking about?" Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know what the Hollow wants. It's why they sent me back. I'm the imbalance. If I return willingly, the town will be safe." Evelyn's breath caught. "You can't." "I have to," Caleb said firmly. "I've been living on borrowed time since they took me. I don't belong here anymore. There has to be another way," Evelyn insisted. "You don't have to do this." Caleb gave her a small, sad smile. "I do. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone. Lydia, Grayson, Dylan. They're all suffering because of me. If my life can save theirs, it's worth it." Evelyn's chest ached with the weight of his words. "What if they're lying? What if they take you and destroy the town anyway?" "Then I'll deal with it," Caleb said, his voice steady. "But you have to promise me something, Evelyn." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Don't let them forget," Caleb said. "Tell them what happened. Make sure they remember the cost of their prosperity." Evelyn swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." That night, Evelyn and Calloway accompanied Caleb to the altar. The woods were darker than ever, the air heavy with the Hollow's presence. Caleb stepped into the circle, his shadow intertwining with the others like smoke drawn into a fire. The Hollow's figure emerged, its red eyes blazing. "He comes willingly," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. The Hollow loomed over Caleb, its voice resonating like a storm. "Do you accept the terms?" Caleb nodded, his face calm. "I do." The shadows surged, enveloping Caleb in a whirlwind of darkness. His eyes met Evelyn's one last time before he vanished, his voice a faint whisper in the air. "Thank you." As the shadows receded, the air in the circle grew lighter. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The Hollow's voice echoed one final time. "The balance is restored." Evelyn and Calloway stood in silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Caleb was gone, but the town was safe for now. The days following Caleb's sacrifice were eerily quiet in Arbor Hollow. The oppressive fog that had lingered over the town seemed to lift, replaced by crisp autumn air. People who had been bedridden with the strange sickness began to recover, their strength returning almost as if nothing had happened. Lydia Hastings reopened the diner, her color back, though her movements were slower. Dylan was back in school, his youthful energy restored. Even Mr. Grayson was seen restocking shelves, muttering about how there was still work to be done. But for Evelyn and Sheriff Calloway, the town's recovery was bittersweet. They had seen the price that had been paid, and the silence that followed Caleb's sacrifice felt like an unspoken reminder of the shadows that had lurked beneath Arbor Hollow's surface for generations. Evelyn couldn't bring herself to return to the library for several days. The weight of her promise to Caleb, to ensure the town never forgot, pressed heavily on her mind. Instead, she spent her time walking the quiet streets, observing how life seemed to fall back into its easy rhythm. But the unease lingered. She noticed how people avoided talking about Caleb. His return and subsequent disappearance were already fading into whispers, buried beneath the relief of the town's newfound prosperity. She finally visited Edna Foster, hoping the older woman might have answers. Edna, however, looked worse than Evelyn had ever seen her. The vitality that had marked her sharp wit was gone, replaced by a frail figure sitting silently in a worn armchair. "Edna," Evelyn said gently, "I need to talk about Caleb. About what happened." Edna looked up, her eyes dull. "I warned you. The Hollow never leaves completely. The debt's been paid for now, but it'll return. It always does. How do we stop it?" Evelyn asked, her voice filled with frustration. "There has to be a way to end this for good." Edna's lips curled into a faint, sad smile. "You can't. It's part of this town, part of its foundation. As long as Arbor Hollow stands, the shadows will always have their due." Evelyn's stomach twisted at the finality of Edna's words. That evening, Evelyn met Calloway at the diner. They sat in a quiet booth near the window, the hum of conversation around them a stark contrast to the tension in their own silence. "We need to do something," Evelyn said, breaking the stillness. "This can't happen again." Calloway stirred his coffee absently, his expression unreadable. "And what do you suggest? Tearing the town apart to find some way to kill shadows?" "We have to start somewhere," Evelyn pressed. "We can't let people forget. That's what the Hollow feeds on, our willingness to pretend nothing happened. It's why it keeps coming back." Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "You think people want to remember? This town thrives on burying its secrets. They'll sweep this under the rug like they always do. Caleb will be just another name in a long line of sacrifices." "Not if we make them remember," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "How?" Evelyn didn't have an answer. Later that night, Evelyn returned to her apartment above the library. She sat at her desk, staring at the collection of notes and records she'd gathered over the past few weeks. Caleb's face lingered in her mind, the quiet acceptance in his eyes as he gave himself to the shadows. She opened her laptop and began typing, pouring out everything she had uncovered. The town's history, the sacrifices, the sickness, and Caleb's final act. As she typed, the air around her grew heavy, the familiar chill creeping into the room. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, and a faint whisper reached her ears. "Evelyn," her fingers froze on the keyboard. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure that was both familiar and alien. Caleb stood before her, his form hazy, his shadow stretching unnaturally behind him. "Caleb," Evelyn breathed, her heart pounding. "You kept your promise," he said, his voice soft but laced with something otherworldly. "But they're watching, Evelyn. They always are." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I thought it was over." Caleb's shadow twitched, and his expression darkened. "It's never over. The balance can't be undone. As long as the town exists, so will they." Evelyn's chest tightened. "Then how do we stop it? Tell me what to do." Caleb's form began to dissolve, his voice fading with him. "Remember, and make them remember. That's the only way." The room fell silent as he vanished, leaving Evelyn alone in the dim light of her desk lamp. The next morning, Evelyn stood in the town square, a stack of flyers in her hands. Each one bore a simple, stark message. "Remember Caleb Vance. Remember the cost." She posted them on telephone poles, in shop windows, and on community bulletin boards, knowing full well the town would resist. But she didn't care. If the people of Arbor Hollow wanted to bury their secrets, Evelyn would ensure they wouldn't stay buried for long. But as she returned to the library that night, she found a new message waiting for her, scrawled in jagged letters across her desk. "The debt is paid. For now." The shadows in the room seemed to shift and whisper a chilling reminder that the Hollow was never far. The message on Evelyn's desk sent a shiver through her. The jagged words seemed carved into the wood, as if burned there by an unseen hand. She stared at them for a long moment, the weight of the warning pressing on her chest. The debt is paid. For now. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. The library's familiar walls felt suffocating, the shadows too alive, too present. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind made her heart race. She sat at her desk, staring at the pile of research she had gathered. If the Hollow always returned, then her work couldn't stop here. Caleb's final words echoed in her mind. Remember, and make them remember. The next morning, Evelyn found Sheriff Calloway at his office, looking as weary as she felt. His desk was cluttered with papers, his coffee mug half empty. He glanced up as she entered, raising an eyebrow at the dark circles under her eyes. "You look like hell," he said. "Thanks," Evelyn replied dryly, dropping into the chair across from him. "I'm not sure I've slept since Caleb," she trailed off, shaking her head. "We need to talk." Calloway leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What now?" Evelyn hesitated. "I think we need to go public with what we know. Not just the town, beyond it. People need to know what's happening here." Calloway's jaw tightened. "You're talking about blowing the lid off Arbor Hollow's deepest, darkest secret. You think the town's going to let that happen?" "They don't have a choice," Evelyn said firmly. "This isn't just about us anymore. The Hollow is a parasite. It'll keep feeding, keep taking, until there's nothing left. If people know the truth, maybe they can help us find a way to stop it. And if the Hollow retaliates?" Calloway asked, his voice low. Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Then we deal with it. But we can't keep pretending this will just go away." Calloway was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" Evelyn spent the next few days compiling everything she knew. She digitized old records, scanned photographs, and recorded testimonies from the town's older residents. Some were reluctant to talk, but others, those who had lost loved ones to the Hollow, spoke with grim determination. The final piece was her own account. The nights spent chasing shadows, the confrontation at the altar, and Caleb's ultimate sacrifice. She poured it all into a document that she shared with online forums, newspapers, and even paranormal investigators. The response was immediate. Reporters began calling, their curiosity piqued by the strange and chilling details of Arbor Hollow's history. Social media lit up with discussions about the town, speculation swirling like wildfire. But not everyone was pleased. The backlash came quickly. Evelyn woke one morning to find the flyers she had posted torn down, her inbox flooded with messages from angry townspeople. At the library, she overheard whispers of how she was stirring up trouble, putting the town in danger. Sheriff Calloway stood by her, but even he faced pressure from the town council to shut her down. "They're scared," he told her one evening as they sat on the library steps. "They think if they bury their heads in the sand, the Hollow will leave them alone." "They're wrong," Evelyn said, staring out at the quiet streets. "The Hollow thrives on ignorance. If we don't stand up to it, it'll keep coming back." One night, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor. Edna Foster arrived at the library, her frail form hunched beneath a heavy coat. She handed Evelyn a small, leather-bound journal. "What's this?" Evelyn asked. "It's mine," Edna said softly. "From when I was a girl. My father was the one who offered the first sacrifice to the Hollow. I thought if I kept quiet, if I didn't tell anyone, it would protect me. But you're right. The only way to fight the Hollow is to shine a light on it." Evelyn opened the journal, her breath catching as she saw page after page of accounts detailing the early days of the sacrifices. It was exactly what she needed to bolster her story. "Thank you, Edna," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me," Edna replied. "Just make sure it's not all for nothing." The following week, Evelyn's efforts culminated in a town meeting. The community hall was packed, the air tense with a mix of curiosity and fear. Evelyn stood at the front of the room, her hands gripping the edge of the podium. "I know many of you think I'm causing trouble," she began. "That by speaking out, I'm putting us all in danger. But staying silent is what brought us here. The hollow feeds on our silence, our willingness to forget. She held up Edna's journal, her voice steady. This town has made sacrifices for decades, but it's time to break the cycle. We need to face the truth, together. There was a long silence, broken only by the murmurs of the crowd. Then, one by one, people began to stand, their faces determined. For the first time, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. That night, as Evelyn walked home, the air felt lighter. The shadows on the street seemed less oppressive, and the town seemed alive. But as she reached her door, she noticed something on the ground. A single, jagged message scrawled in the dirt. "We are watching." Evelyn stared at the words, her resolve unshaken. The hollow might be watching, but so was she, and she would never stop. The shadows of Arbor Hollow would never disappear entirely, but for the first time in generations, the town was awake. And Evelyn Marsh would make sure it stayed that way.